All right, welcome everyone. We are live. I'm Deirdre Longacre-Smeltzer, the MAA Senior Director for Programs, and I'm here with Michael Pearson, MAA's Executive Director. Good to see you, Michael.
Great to be here tonight. I'm really looking forward to tonight's lecture.
Yeah, I'm pleased to welcome another audience to our second event of the 2023 season of our Distinguished Lecture Series. As usual, one of the really great features of doing these lectures virtually is that we can interact with an audience from around the world. So I invite you, anyone who is interested and willing, just drop in the chat where you are joining from. And it's a good opportunity to just mention that the YouTube chat should be active throughout our talk. And so at any point, feel free to also put in feedback or questions for the speaker, and we'll take time at the end then for some Q&A with tonight's speaker, which is Dr. Karen Parshall. So welcome to everybody.
And for those of you who were with us back in November at our distinguished lecture then with Della Dumbaugh, I'll just think it's an interesting fact that Della was Karen's student, PhD student.
Indeed, that's right, indeed. Yeah, so very honored to have Dr. Parshall with us. I'm going to also just share with the audience a few of the opportunities that we have going on with MAA currently or upcoming. So if you're thinking about your summer plans, we have quite a few workshops actually that we're going to be offering this summer. I'll just mention a few of them. Our PIC Math program, PIC Math stands for Preparations for Industrial Careers in Mathematical Sciences, and it's a great program that works with faculty and prepares them to work with students in preparation for industrial careers. So that program is offering a summer workshop, and applications are being accepted now through March 31st. Our Open Math program will be going live shortly, and there will be a variety of summer workshops offered through them, including our CoMinds program. CoMinds is the College Mathematics Instructor Development Source program and offers, again, workshops for faculty to learn how to build programs, and has a great alignment of resources for faculty. And just to mention one other opportunity for new to the profession faculty, we are accepting Project Next applications for faculty who are new to the profession for the 2023-24 cohort. So all of that can be found online at our maa.org website, and encourage you to take a look and check out the many resources that are available.
Absolutely. And those new Project Next fellows will be joining us at Math Fest this summer. Mm-hmm. And registration for Math Fest is going to open very soon in the next few days. So we encourage you to look at that information. That's somewhere where we can all gather together this summer and celebrate our mathematical community. I know I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my happiest times of the year, is that I feel like it's a family reunion every year. So I'm looking forward to that.
Indeed, and it is really, I still feel like it's a great pleasure to be able to join with people in person at Math Fest instead of being only virtual.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, well, we are a few minutes past the top of the hour, so I will welcome everyone again to our distinguished lecture featuring Dr. Karen Parshall, and I will just mention again that YouTube chat will be live throughout the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Michael, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Deirdre. Hello, Karen.
Hi, Michael. How are you?
I'm doing great. Welcome. It's so great to have you here. I remember actually it was the first time I met you was at our centennial meeting in 2015 in Washington, D.C. And you gave a lecture that really, well, I'll just say that even though I had people pulling at me all through that meeting, I sat there for the entire time and I refused to go when people were trying to drag me out. So I'm really looking forward to hearing tonight's talk. And I gather that lecture, in fact, in 2015 was you were sharing a little bit of a preview of the work that you were planning to do in order to produce your most recent book, which I'm going to do a little, yep, that one, which I'm excited to both hold, but also hear more about tonight. Let me just say, I looked up on MAA reviews about this book, and the review concluded by saying that New Era is an impressive synthesis of a vast amount of source material. It is clearly the definitive treatment of the ascendancy of the American research mathematics community to international prominence during the first half of the 20th century. And I think that's pretty good praise, and I can't argue with it, having the book in my own hands, and I've been enjoying it myself. So, Karen, just to finish the introduction, Karen is the Commonwealth Professor of History and Mathematics at the University of Virginia. She holds a joint appointment in the Corcoran Department of History as well as the Department of Mathematics. She earned her PhD in the University of Chicago, and her work focuses naturally on the development of mathematics in the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th century. Karen's a fellow of both the American Mathematical Society and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. She's the 2008 winner of the Albert Leon Whiteman Memorial Prize of the AMS for her outstanding work in the history of mathematics. So I know we're in for a treat tonight. And Karen, I look forward to listening to your talk tonight, How World War II Shaped the American Mathematical Community. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael, for that nice introduction. Okay, so let me begin. The war ended in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. It went longer in the Pacific, but was over there on the 2nd of December. For American mathematicians, as for the rest of the country, the fall of 1945 marked the beginning of the transition back to peacetime. But what exactly would that mean? For those who had not left their colleges and universities, what would it mean? Well, carrying on with their usual teaching and administrative duties, especially for those who had shouldered the teaching overloads of special training courses for the military's recruits in arithmetic, trigonometry, and other basics. For others, returning to academic positions left vacant while they participated in the war effort away from their campuses. Some would leave academia for different pursuits altogether, their tastes having been wedded for occupations more rewarding than the routine low-level teaching that tended to define professional lives outside the more elite research-oriented schools. Some would quickly pick their research back up where it had left off. Others would shift into new mathematical areas. Still others would move on, having been permanently diverted from the research ideal they had earlier embraced. The fall of 1945 also marked the establishment of a new world order. The Allies had won the war. Germany had been crushed. The United States had emerged from the conflict as a major world power. The same actually seemed true of the American mathematical community. The United States, asserted John Kline categorically from the dais at the MAA's annual meeting on the 25th of November, 1945, has assumed world leadership in mathematics. As he saw it, that leadership brings responsibilities, both for imparting the results to coming generations and for ever widening the frontiers of mathematical truth. The Americans now had to set the bar for mathematical training as well as for original research. they had a lot to do. Jockeying for position relative to post-war scientific initiatives and funding began even before the war ended. In particular, in the summer of 1944, plans were being discussed for the establishment of a post-war research board for national security that would function as a joint military and civilian research agency. Scientists, as well as military leaders, hoped not to repeat the mistakes that had followed World War I relative to preparedness for war, or really lack thereof, in peacetime. Yet it wasn't clear just what an RBNS might look like, how it would be set up, and what role mathematics would play in it. By May of 1945, it had been decided that a 5 to 7 person mathematics panel would be appointed within the RBNS, and that Princeton's Oswald Veblen should provide a list of some 10 possible candidates from which to choose. The question of what names to include was clearly a political one, and those from whom Veblen sought advice saw things somewhat differently. Ultimately, though, as Veblen described it, there was good agreement about the following list of names: Warren Weaver, Marston Morse, Richard Courant, E.J. McShane. Sorry about that. C.B. Morey. Seems to be malfunctioning a bit. C.B. Morey or Griffith Evans, both of the University of California. Adrian Albert or L.M. Graves, both of the University of Chicago. And E. Boda of Bell Labs. To this list, it was decided to add Saunders McLean or Marshall Stone, who were both at Harvard. But while Veblen held that it would be wise to include Stone, those are his words, others were, quote, very dubious. Stone had clearly ruffled more than a few feathers while AMS president, and his adamant advocacy of mathematics and his often strident opposition of the federally funded applied mathematics panel in general, and of the panel's head in particular, Warren Weaver. Veblen also singled out 4 younger men: topologist John Kelly, topologist later turned statistician John Tukey, Hasler Whitney, and Garrett Burkhoff, before recommending McShane as the first choice and McLean the second for the panel's head. In Veblen's view, both had displayed all the necessary qualities for leadership: McShane at the Aberdeen Proving Ground and McLean within the Applied Mathematics panel, and both had acquired the right sort of background experience. A mathematics panel within an RBNS so constituted would unquestionably have reflected some of the best technical and administrative talent then available within the American mathematical community for dealing with the applications of mathematics to matters of national security. It would also have firmly established some of the members of the next generation of that community's leadership, among whom, notably, was at least one 1930s emigre. Indeed, post-war leadership would be key. Planning for and discussion of the RBNS continued into the fall of 1945, but funding ultimately proved to be a fatal sticking point. Nevertheless, Congress continued to debate the ever-evolving legislation that Harley Kilgore, Democratic senator from West Virginia, had originally introduced in 1942, and that would ultimately result in 1950 in the founding of the National Science Foundation. It acted, however, in the summer of 1946 when it authorized the creation of the Office of Naval Research, a body that, at least relative to the Navy, would serve a purpose similar to that of the ill-fated RBNS. Under physicist Emmanuel Piore, the ONR was committed primarily to the support of fundamental research in the sciences, and resulted from a basic policy decision which recognized that the United States must be strong scientifically if it is to be strong militarily. Computer, logistics, mathematics, and mechanics branches defined its main foci. And Miniris Weaver's former assistant at the Applied Mathematics panel was tapped to head mathematics. Rees assumed her new post in August of 1946 and immediately began consulting with a wide range of members of the American mathematical community to get their ideas on how her new department could best aid them in their work while, at the same time, fulfilling the needs of the Navy. This dual purpose initially made it unclear whether the Navy would support research in what most American mathematicians actually did, namely pure mathematics, since the most obvious types of mathematical research, which would seem to warrant Navy support, would be research in applied directions. Fortunately, that point was quickly clarified when it was decided as a matter of policy that sound support of mathematical research in this country must include support of work in pure mathematics. The political battles fought during the war to win recognition for the critical role of mathematics writ large in the nation's service had apparently been won. Rees then proceeded to craft and implement from scratch a program based on the screening of proposals by a committee of mathematical peers that funded basic research in both pure and applied mathematics, in addition to postdoctoral support, teaching release, and sabbatical leaves. In another key innovation, it also provided assistance to universities. Assistance to universities which were taking steps to strengthen their research activity in either pure or applied mathematics, and particularly in parts of the country which lacked strong research centers. The ONR, through Navy contracts administered directly to institutions, thus became virtually the only source of funds available for the support of basic research in the mathematical sciences in the immediately post-war period. More importantly, Rees had ushered the field into the brave new world of grant-funded research that has characterized it ever since. As one of her contemporaries put it, there could be no doubt that mathematics had been recognized once and for all to be important, like physics, chemistry, and engineering mechanics, and was so treated. So just as those in Washington envisioned and created new administrative structures like the RBNS and the ONR in the months after the war, so too did those in the American mathematical community. The war's end had not only made superfluous the War Policy Committee that the AMS and the MAA had jointly created in December 1942, but it had also raised questions about what roles the two organizations should play in the post-war world and how they should coordinate. In April 1946, a policy committee for mathematics comprised of 6 members was formed with 4 representatives from the AMS: Griffith Evans, Marston Morse, and Theophile Hildebrandt, with Stone as chair. That is, the AMS presidents who had led the society just before, during, and after the war. There was also be 1 representative, Alonzo Church, from the Association of Symbolic Logic, and 1, Willie Feller, from the Institute of Mathematical Statistics. But notably absent in this list was the MAA. It had actually opted not to be officially associated with a policy committee that would have 4 members from the AMS, but only a proposed 2 from the MAA. MAA Secretary Treasurer William Carver, for one, felt that in view of the way the policy committee was set up, it would be better if the association not recognize it in any way. If Stone and the AMS wanted heavy-handedly to skew the committee, as some in the MAA perceived, towards the politics of mathematics solely at the research level, the MAA would push its own educational agenda. "We complain," Carver told immediately past MAA President Cyrus McDuffie, "about what the education people are doing to secondary school education. I believe that our inactivity with regard to these matters is responsible in some degree for the situation that exists, namely the tension between what has been termed academic mathematics and more practical or vocational mathematics." Ultimately, McDuffie proposed the formation of various committees, as well as the participation of the MAA in a number of national curricular reform initiatives. Indeed, throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s, the MAA continued to promote dialogue on mathematics education and curricular reform, even as the wartime legitimation of school mathematics waxed into mathematics' relative curricular insignificance during the immediately post-war years. This seemingly perennial issue would raise its head once again when the Cold War, ever more frigid by 1957, witnessed Russia's launch of Sputnik. But mathematics education at the lower levels was by no means the only immediately post-war concern. John Kline focused his November 1945 address before the MAA on precisely the issue of the rehabilitation of graduate work as a means of post-war recovery and development of scientific talent. The war, he documented, had resulted in a very rapid decrease in the number of doctorates and master's degrees in mathematics, with PhDs dropping from a high of 104 in 1939 and 1941 to only 39 in 1944, and master's degrees falling from 303 in 1940 to 114 in 1944. In the conservative opinion of the government's Office of Scientific Personnel, moreover, it will be 1955 before we will be producing the number of PhDs that we would have expected to produce each year if the growth of graduate work had continued at the same rate as in the decade 1930 to 1940. The country, so it seemed, faced dire consequences unless the rhythm of graduate work was quickly reestablished. A dearth of mathematicians could result both in industry and in the research and teaching staffs of colleges and universities. There could also be, according to Kline, a concomitant lowering of the mathematical competence of the nation at a moment when mathematics had been shown to have made tremendous contributions to our national war effort, and to have been the means by which other sciences had been able to make much more significant contributions than might otherwise have been possible. These things couldn't be allowed to happen if the US was going to retain what Kline and many of his colleagues saw as its newly gained position of world leadership in mathematics. Much seemed to be riding then on graduate education. But graduate work thrives in strong departments, and at least one traditionally trend-setting department had slipped over the course of the 1930s, despite continuing to train prodigious numbers of students: the University of Chicago. Instrumental in instilling the research ethos in the United States at the turn of the 20th century, and still widely deemed one of the big three, along with Harvard and Princeton, prior to World War II, Chicago was producing research with a rather dated feel by the 1930s, especially in geometry and analysis, although not at all in algebra. Its faculty and graduate students were publishing, but their research didn't attract much contemporary attention outside extended Chicago circles. Mathematical inbreeding, that is, the hiring of students and then of students' students, had largely been the culprit. This began to change immediately after the war. As is well known, Chicago was the site of the first sustained nuclear chain reaction in December 1942, and in its metallurgical laboratory of other research critical to the Manhattan Project, like that of Chicago mathematics PhD, Ernest Wilkins, on neutron absorption. The concentration there during the war of top-flight physical scientists like Enrico Fermi, James Franck, and Harold Urey prompted then University Chancellor Robert Hutchins, to seize the opportunity of snagging some of that talent for his university's permanent faculty. As at Berkeley in the 1930s, it was quickly realized that a world-class group in the physical sciences should be complemented by a world-class group in mathematics. Given that Leonard Dixon and Gilbert Bliss had retired in 1939 and 1941 respectively, the timing was propitious for Hutchins to rebuild his math department. With the guidance, among others, of John von Neumann, whom Hutchins had gotten to know during the war, Hutchins had set his sights on Marshall Stone as early as May of 1945 and had entered into discussions with him that would last for a full year. Stone, then the chair of the math department at Harvard, drove a really hard bargain. It wouldn't be enough for him to come to Chicago as a chaired professor at the then princely salary of $15,000 a year. He'd actually have to be named chair of the department. He'd also need assurances from Hutchins that he'd have the resources actually to build the department beyond its pre-war average of 11 members and to move it into previously unrepresented areas, including applied mathematics, statistics, and electronic computing. Stone thus asked point blank, is the university, that is the chancellor, relative to approve expenditures for this purpose at a rate not to exceed $150,000 per annum? After Hutchins personally assured Stone that he wanted Chicago's mathematics group to be the best in the country and that Stone would have the complete support of the administration in his efforts to raise the work in mathematics there to the highest possible level, the deal was finally sealed. Stone joined the Chicago faculty effective the 1st of July, 1946, and immediately got to work. Big good things are happening at Chicago, reported then current member of the undergraduate teaching staff, William Karish. Every bastard in the department is quaking in his boots. In mathematics, that faculty comprised, at the rank of professor, geometer and Chicago PhD Ernest Lane, who was Stone's immediate predecessor as chair, analyst and former Bliss student Lawrence Graves, and algebraist and former student of Dixon, Adrian Albert. At the associate professor level, analyst and another former student of Bliss, Magnus Hessinus, and emigre algebraist Otto Schilling. At the assistant professor level, topologist John Kelly, and at the rank of instructor, algebraist Irving Kaplansky and former Albert student Daniel Zielinski. Stone had immediately arranged for an offer of an assistant professorship to probabilist Paul Halmos, so he was also on the faculty at the start of Stone's first fall quarter in residence. By the end of Stone's first year, though, Hessinus, Kelly, and Zielinski had all left. The first for a professorship at UCLA, the second for a position at Berkeley, and the third for a fellowship at the Institute. Hasler Whitney had declined a Chicago offer, and Stone had been authorized by February 1947 to move on to Andre Vey and Saunders McLean. Both accepted, although in Vey's case, not without much negotiation and some trepidation on the part of the higher administration. Both arrived in the fall of 1947. So too did Polish emigre and Penn harmonic analysis analyst Antoni Zygmunt. At the assistant professor level, analyst and Yale PhD Irving Siegel, as well as Michigan PhD Edwin Spanier, joined the department in 1948. By the fall of 1949, Xingshun Shun had also joined them, having fled Civil War-torn China. The Stone department, reflective of the new mathematical and geopolitical world order as well as of its chair's international outlook, was complete, at least relative to the purer side of the field. Although Stone's broader aim of also building in applied mathematics, statistics, and electronic computing ultimately went unrealized within the math department. Still, in 3 short years, he had succeeded brilliantly, although not without much effort despite the university's initial assurances of total cooperation, in extending the department to the then cutting edges of pure mathematical research and in transforming what has been characterized as, quote, a department of dwindling prestige and vitality once more into the strongest mathematics department in the US, and at that point, probably in the world. Chicago's metamorphosis in the immediately post-war years was unquestionably exceptional. But Chicago was by no means alone in recognizing and acting on the possibilities presented by the booming post-war market for mathematicians. Some universities continued to build on the gains they had made in the 1930s. Others saw their opportunity actually to move into the research ranks. Among the latter were universities in the South, where research-level mathematics had been comparatively slow to take hold. In 1952, the National Research Council's Division of Mathematics, chaired by Marston Morse, issued a preliminary report on the regional development of mathematical research that, in providing a remarkable mid-century snapshot of the lay of the American mathematical landscape, highlighted in particular those graduate programs that were then regarded in some sense as emerging or new centers of serious and scholarly activities in mathematics. Among those were two, Tulane and Louisiana State University in Louisiana, a state that was part of a greater southern region where only two such centers, Texas at Austin and Rice, had been recognized before. Both departments had leaders with deep ties to the South who were intent on building mathematics there. At Tulane, Bill Duren, Mississippi native, 1926 Tulane alumnus, and 1930 Chicago PhD under Bliss, had taken a job at his undergraduate alma mater in 1931 and had risen through the ranks there to become chair of the math department in 1947. Duren, in his words, had been faced with the young Southerners' problem after graduate school of whether to stay north, where conditions were obviously better, or to return south. He chose the latter. In a lecture entitled Scientists for the South, given before his fellow members of New Orleans' distinguished Round Table Club in October 1948, Duren made a compelling case for why the immediate post-war years were right for the promotion in the South of science in general and of mathematics in particular. First, he argued, floods of veterans would be coming back to study with government money for tuition. And as after World War I, there would be a new swing towards mathematics and the sciences. Second, ongoing discussions in Washington made it clear that the government was committed in principle to subsidies for scientific study and research as necessary for the national welfare and security. Since federal dollars were likely to flow regionally, it would be necessary to take the lead in one's own region to qualify for these funds. The challenge was palpable, so Duren had resolved to come back and try to rebuild our own Department of Mathematics at Tulane. That process began when the department applied for and was awarded an Office of Naval Research contract for a study of functional analysis in topological algebras that included the explicit regional development goal of establishing a doctoral program in mathematics at Tulane. By 1951, that program had turned out the first of its some 24 1950s PhDs. Duren's counterpart at LSU, Texan Luther Wade, had completed his 1941 analytic number theoretic dissertation under the direction of Leonard Karlitz at Duke. After short stints at Hopkins and the Institute, Wade had returned to Duke before accepting LSU's offer to head its Department of Mathematics in 1948. His institutional mandate was explicit: build a research department. But as at Tulane, that would be an uphill battle, but for different reasons. Tulane was privately funded. LSU was financially dependent on the vagaries of the Louisiana state legislature. Tulane's department was small and successfully hired 2 researchers in Duren's first year as chair. LSU's was large and fully staffed at the higher ranks by mid-career master's and/or PhD holders who did little or no research and were effectively there for the long haul. Like Duren at Tulane, though, Wade began by trying to hire strong researchers in order to change the departmental dynamics. In his first year, he approached Edwin Hewitt, a Harvard-trained harmonic analyst who, in 1948, had just taken up an assistant professorship in the Northwest at the University of Washington, another mathematically developing area of the country. Hewitt quite naturally sought the take on the situation at LSU of his Tulane friend, Duren, and received a very candid assessment in reply. Duren started with the positives. LSU seemed to Duren to have resources, a relatively large pool of potential graduate students, an acceptable mathematics library, and a new president who's determined to do things and seems to know how. But the negatives were also formidable. The department, comprised of some 35 to 40 full-time people, had a large collection of dead wood, with former high school teachers, junior college teachers, etc., at lower ranks. I think, Duren explained, all the main people have ranks of associate professor or higher, and not one has any chance of developing as a mathematician. Still, Wade evidently has a green light to bring some mathematicians in over their heads, and while they undoubtedly accept this, it doesn't make for sweetness and light. In the end, Hewitt stayed in Seattle, but Wade did succeed in making a number of research active hires into the 1950s and in growing the graduate program at LSU. Although the stories of Chicago, Tulane, and LSU in the immediately post-war period are very different, they underscore the possibilities for mathematics that those years presented for departments in a position to capitalize on them. As the preliminary report on the regional development of mathematics documented, such programs had emerged in the Midwest, West, and Northwest in addition to the South, while the Northeast also continued to grow. Despite the worries of Kline and others of a severe post-war shortage of mathematicians, it actually turned out to be a bull market for those mathematicians like Helmos, who had been underemployed during the Depression and war years, as well as for more recent PhDs like Hewitt and Spanier. That there was no post-war shortage of mathematicians or of new mathematical results to be published was almost immediately reflected in the avalanche of submissions under which American journal editors found themselves buried. All of the journals increased their number of pages published after 1945, coincident, unfortunately, with a period of soaring publication costs. By 1948, all were bursting at the seams, and the editors of some, like the Duke Mathematical Journal and the AMS's two journals, the Bulletin and the Transactions, were particularly concerned. In Durham, Leonard Carlitz, editor of the Duke Mathematical Journal, found himself in the unenviable position of having to explain in 1949 that his journal was at present very crowded and at the same time had been forced for financial reasons to cut the number of pages published. Consequently, he and his editorial board had decided some time ago not to accept any new papers until we've been able to catch up with the backlog. Backlog was a particularly pressing issue at the AMS. As a result, it had been decided by April 1949 to establish two new periodicals. The proceedings of the AMS would relieve the Bulletin by publishing all submissions except meeting reports, other than society-related pieces, and texts of invited addresses given before the society. Although this ultimately helped reduce what was then an 18-month delay from time of acceptance to time of publication for bulletin articles, a sizable backlog persisted into the 1950s, even following increases in the total number of pages published by the bulletin and the proceedings combined. The editors of the Transactions, on the other hand, were empowered to select longer papers and groups of cognate papers submitted for their review for inclusion in a non-periodical but serial publication to be called the Memoirs of the AMS, and to be issued and sold in separate volumes. By 1951, the Transactions backlog problem had been relieved by the publication of the first 9 memoirs. The situation was further improved in 1951 by the creation of a brand new journal, the Pacific Journal of Mathematics, yet another new model for the publication of mathematical research. The Pacific Journal, unlike the other extant mathematical periodicals, wasn't associated with a single university or with a society, but rather represented the editorial and financial collaboration of 12 West Coast colleges and universities. Conceived by Berkeley's František Wolf and UCLA's Edwin Beckenbach as a research journal open, just like its competitors, to mathematicians all over the country, it nevertheless aimed to highlight the many institutional advances on the West Coast that had been made relative to mathematics. Wolf was a Czech émigré who had come to the US from Sweden in 1941 before being hired by Griffith Evans at Berkeley by 1942. Beckenbach, a Texas native who had earned his PhD at Rice in 1931, had, after a series of intermediate positions, landed his UCLA professorship in 1945. Both felt the time was right for a West Coast-based journal. The mathematics department chairs of all of the principal institutions on the West Coast concurred and secured financial commitments ranging from $250 to $500 from their respective schools in support of the new publication ventures, as well as from the AMS and the newly founded Institute for Numerical Analysis. So the institutions that joined together, collaborated on this new journal were the University of British Columbia, Caltech, the Universities of California at Berkeley, Davis, Los Angeles, and Santa Barbara, the University of Southern California, Stanford, Washington State College, the University of Washington, and as I said, the AMS and the Institute for Numerical Analysis. At the end of its first year of publication, the Pacific Journal had printed some 602 pages of new research produced by over 50 mathematicians on the West Coast, around the country, and from abroad. It was like an overnight success. The issue of backlog, though, was perhaps even more overwhelming for the math reviews than for any of the other research journals. Because of both the greater availability of foreign journals after the war and what was perceived as the increased production in most countries, material to review was ever mounting. Another factor at play by 1950 was the policy of encouraging longer reviews for Russian papers. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Stalin's Soviet Russia came quickly to dominate Eastern Europe, thereby establishing what Winston Churchill famously termed in a 1946 speech, an iron curtain separating Eastern from Western Europe. In mathematics, this new geopolitical reality manifested itself in a decision that Russian mathematicians would publish solely in Russian. This would make it difficult for American mathematicians to keep up with new Russian results at a time when that seemed particularly critical. The new policy that the math reviews adopted thus aimed to make it easier for English-speaking mathematicians to get more than just the gist of the results that a given Russian paper contained. The AMS's Committee on the Role of the Society in Mathematical Publication also seemed to sense the beginning of the Cold War and its possible implications for mathematics. In February 1948, it proposed the launch of a project for the publication of translations of important Russian mathematical articles, as well as for the preparation of a Russian-English dictionary of important mathematical terms, supplemented by a pamphlet to include the Russian alphabet, rules of syntax, and short bibliography of works available in parallel Russian and English versions. By April, not only had a committee been formed to prepare the pamphlet, but Minna Reese at the ONR had also allocated $25,000 to pay for both it and the translations themselves. Yet another committee had been appointed by the end of the year, actually to select articles for translation. 2 years later, in 1950, some 42 papers were in various stages of translation, and the dictionary, short grammar, and 15 translations of Russian mathematical articles were complete. Overly high distribution costs had given the AMS pause, though. By 1953, when the ONR could no longer afford to support the project, 105 papers by Andrei Kolmogorov and Ivan Vinogradov, among many others, had been translated and published. The American mathematical community was in high gear in the immediately post-war years. Internationally, it endeavored to reestablish mathematical ties that the war had broken and to help its foreign colleagues regain their mathematical footing. In a national context, it worked to position itself effectively within emerging bureaucracies like the ultimately ill-fated Research Board for National Security and the highly successful Office of Naval Research, fully aware of the importance that external funding would likely have for future research productivity. It also sought to exercise its authority over matters such as secondary mathematics education, in which it had failed to engage with sufficient energy and innovation before the war. And then there was research. Departments focused tightly on their graduate programs, both in training future researchers and in boosting their faculties with the best talent they could acquire. The talent was out there. The post-war hiring boom had meant that the roughly 30 programs that had been considered established before the war were, in the course of just a few years, augmented by some 1.5 times that number of research-oriented programs across the country, including areas like the South, where research-level mathematics had traditionally been less strong. This growth was reflected in a volume of research that, in swamping American publication outlets, prompted the creation of new ones by a community that was agile and mature enough by the 1940s to adapt by creatively marshaling new and extant resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. That was a really excellent presentation. Let me just remind our audience of a few things. The first one is that in just a moment, we will have an opportunity for Q&A with Dr. Parshall. So please enter questions that you have into the YouTube chat, and then we'll take some time for Dr. Parshall to interact with those questions. I also want to just remind people that because this is on YouTube, if you enjoyed the presentation, you can watch it again. You can share it with your friends. You can it'll be there along with other distinguished lectures for future viewing. And I will also take this opportunity to let people know that in 5 weeks from today, our third presenter for this season, Dr. Laura Tallman, will be offering a presentation. So mark your calendars for that as well. So Karen, turning back to your talk, it was, first of all, very interesting to hear your presentation on the juxtaposition of the societal and political factors surrounding the war and immediately after the war, and how that influenced the mathematical community and production of the establishment of departments, production of journals. It was all very interesting to sort of see that that juxtaposition. I personally was particularly fascinated, I guess, by Mina Reese, appointed as head of the ONR. Yes, and I'm curious if you could. I'm curious if you could say anything more about what the. It seems to me that was an unusual type of appointment. There weren't very many women in your slides that you showed. So is there anything that you can say about whether that was controversial? How did that come? How did she come to hold that type of high profile position?
Well, I think I mentioned she was the assistant to Warren Weaver at the Applied Mathematics panel during World War II. And in that role, she personally went all over the country soliciting mathematicians to work on projects for the Applied Mathematics panel. She was the one person who really knew everything that was going on in the Applied Mathematics panel, and she earned the respect of everyone basically with whom she came into contact. So that's people in the military, people in the mathematics community, people in the government. So she had the connections, and so for those reasons, she was probably almost the obvious choice.
It sounds like she must have been quite a remarkable person to have
Yes, she
accomplished all
was.
that. Yeah, that's great. Well, let me I don't see any questions in the chat yet, so let me just invite people once more to put any comments or questions that you have for Dr. Parshall in the chat. We'll wait just a few more minutes. I see, well, Michael Pearson in a private chat has mentioned that Mina Reese hired Mary Dulciani at Hunter College. So Mary Dulciani, of course, is a very familiar name in our among the MAA. And yes, in answer to the question about was this Mina Reese, yes, I was asking about Mina Reese, and Dr. Parshall was offering some additional comments about that. Well, we won't prolong this, but let me just give another minute if anybody wants to engage with our speaker. I know it's not quite the same as being able to use the mic, but. Okay, I see that, well, again, in the private chat, Michael Pearson has commented that he is interested in the tension between pure and applied math in the aftermath of World War II. So it's not exactly a question. I don't know if you have any response to that, Karen, but just observing the tension between pure and applied math.
Well, I'm not so sure there was a tension between pure and applied math, but they were definitely recognized as two different things. And the AMS was trying to obviously support research mathematics in pure mathematics, but at the same time, it was also trying to support some applied mathematics. And so, I mean, it was trying to create a broader community of mathematicians. Didn't exactly succeed in doing that because its heart was really in pure mathematics. But but yeah, the two were. Let's just put it this way: pure mathematics has a harder PR problem to solve than applied mathematics does. That's why there was a lot of worry about whether something like the Navy would even see any applicability or any use for pure mathematics. But again, the people like the AMS presidents and the MAA presidents during the war, Mina Reese, many others, convinced the government and the armed services that pure mathematics and applied mathematics were both in their best interests.
Both had their value. Yeah. All right, well, now we have several questions over here. I'll sort of look at them in order, but feel free to also grab onto any that particularly appeal to you, Karen. But I see there's a question about computer engineering not having a successful trajectory at the ONR. Is that, I guess, is that an accurate statement? And if so, can you explain anything more about that, Karen?
Well, it was really at the University of Chicago where it didn't have a positive trajectory. Mina Reese was all over computer engineering, but no, it was Stone who also thought the future was at least partly in computer engineering. He wanted to institute it at Chicago, and that's what failed. No, it was quite successful at the ONR.
And that may be also linked then to the question from David Roberts about, can you say more about the failure of Stone's plans for applied math at Chicago?
Right. Well, the part of the problem was, even though Hutchins had, promised him the full support of the administration, it was expensive. And Stone had already basically blown his budget. And, applied mathematicians, computer scientists, that was going to require more space, more hires. And I think also, not to put it all on Hutchins and the finances of the University of Chicago, Stone himself kind of ran out of steam at a certain point. His interest shifted to his work in his more international work, and he, was more outward looking than inward looking. So, I mean, I think it was very hard on him trying to negotiate with all these people, and I think he partly ran out of steam.
Yep. I see another question about Chicago from James, and particular interest in Ernest Williams, and sort of an open-ended question. Do we know more about him?
Yeah, well, it's Ernest Wilkins, and he was a PhD at the University of Chicago. As I mentioned, he had been a student of, so to answer the question, a lot is known about him. He had been an undergraduate at Chicago and then a graduate student there. He got his PhD with Hestinus, who had been a Bliss student in calculus of variations. And he was he was a phenomenon. At the time he got his bachelor's degree at Chicago, he was the youngest person ever to do that at Chicago. So he was really considered a phenomenon. And then he was very instrumental with the Manhattan Project related work that they were doing at Chicago. So I don't know. I mean, he's a very interesting character.
Yeah, thank you. You must feel like you get to know these folks pretty well.
Yeah.
I guess shifting gears here. So Lynn has a question about the SMSG effort, which I assume that's the School Mathematics Study Group involving these folks. I don't know if you have any response to that question.
Right. Well, that came a little bit later than the period I was talking about. But yeah, people like McLean and many of the others were very involved in that. And I mean, it was part of this emphasis that the MAA decided to place, to be more proactive about education at the secondary level in particular. I mean, I think that the comments of Carver to McDuffie were pretty telling. They kind of realized that maybe they should have been paying more attention to this, and then in the 1950s they did, and 60s with the SMSG.
With the SMSG, yeah. Thank you. All right, and maybe we will wrap up the evening with a question here from Christine Stevens about the publication of the proceedings of the AMS somewhere in Wisconsin and in Providence, Rhode Island, and in particular interested in the Wisconsin connection.
I have no idea, Christine. I didn't pick up on that. The Providence connection is clear. I'll look into it. I'll get back to you on that one.
All right. Well, let's leave it on a cliffhanger then.
I'm sorry. I didn't notice the Wisconsin connection, so I'll look into that.
No, it's always good to leave with something we don't quite know.
More research to do. There's always more research to do.
Yes. Well, thank you again so much, Karen, for a really interesting presentation. And thank you to everybody who joined us this evening. And we hope to see you back in 5 weeks. Good night.
Thank you very much.